Right, it's really just not just the
A lot of architects make buildings in 3.
The dolly show is great.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's so much less crowd. Part of it's
Less fun.
oh, right, yeah.
Bluetooth connection. Lumbar support level.
Maybe I'll
But it's cheaper. Yeah. That's right. You go like that a couple times.
Can you see that one? Your eyes are gonna get stuck.
Yeah, we're a lot of talk. Yeah. These are targeted colors.
Okay, I think we should start. It's past 4. So please please join me in welcoming Jean Magnier, who's visiting us today and tomorrow. He's visiting the LSST group and department here. Jean this is not his first time at University of Washington. He did his PhD at MIT and then a postdoc in Amsterdam. But after that, he was a postdoctoral fellow here and a research professor here as well before moving on to Hawaii, where he's an astronomer right now at the IFA. Jean's accomplishments are many. I don't think I have to especially say anything special about him in this room, since he's worked with many of you while he was here. But some of the things he's worked on was the Elixir pipeline for CFHT. He was the primary developer, and most recently he worked on the Pan-STARRS survey. I think he's possibly one of the most, if not the most important person in making sure that the data that Pan-STARRS is collecting is transformed into the form that's useful for science, that us mere mortals can understand, so catalogs as opposed to images with all sorts of interesting artifacts. And having Jean here at this moment of time is I think, really great, because Pan-STARRS, after a couple of years of observations and operations, is just about to put out their first public data release, and hearing about this survey and about what it can do will be a fantastic thing for all of us. So again, Jean, thank you for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mario, and thank you everyone for coming up to listen to my little chat. So I'll be talking about Pan-STARRS and the astrometric survey aspects of Pan-STARRS, and a little bit about the local solar neighborhood work that we're doing, and particularly concentrating on the ultra-cold dwarf component of this local solar neighborhood. So Pan-STARRS, and I'm going to start off with a very general overview of what Pan-STARRS is doing, has done, and what kind of science is coming out of Pan-STARRS, and what the data products are going into the public release, before I focus in on the ultra-cold dwarf science. And at the end, towards the end, I'll talk in detail about some of the interesting little fiddly bits that we have to worry about to get good astrometry. So Pan-STARRS is a 1.8 meter telescope. It has been operational on the summit of Haleakala since 2007, and since 2010 we've been doing this big survey. It's actually right next door to a new telescope that is just being completed called PS2. PS2 is expected to start work with Pan-STARRS 1 in roughly June of next year. And both of them are now doing a completely NASA paid for NEO search survey. And so the science mission that was much more broad has now ended and is transforming into this NEO survey. So the stuff that I'll talk about is all with Pan-STARRS 1, and is all coming from the general science survey. which
is two the same as one?
the
dome is totally different.
The same. Well, the mirror is the same size and was by the same manufacturer, but this telescope was built by a different company. The dome is completely different. There's a whole bunch of differences.
Okay.
Don't ask. So the Pan-STARRS 1 science surveys that have actually a variety of different kinds of surveys in one system. The telescope is completely dedicated to doing surveying, but at a few different scales. The big scale, the main survey that took most of the time, 56% of the time, is what we call the 3 pi survey, covering the whole sky. And this is the density of log density of objects in the sky at 20th magnitude from our observations. And actually, this little band down here is simulated 2-mass data, but don't worry about that. And the 3 pi survey covered the whole area of the sky above deck of -30, all the area that we could basically conveniently observe from Hawaii repeatedly. So by now, over the past, after the 4 years of survey is complete, we've built up about 10 to 15 epochs on every field in every filter. There's 5 filters, GRIZY, which match the Sloan filters, plus Y band is slightly redder than the Z band on Sloan. There's also a medium deep survey, which basically targets specific fields, 10 fields in depth, and takes much longer exposures. Every field that's observable, so about 5 fields, is observed every night in a single filter or 2 filters when it's GNR's turn. And then there's a survey that is basically dedicated to try to find moving objects in the solar system, and they use a filter that the other surveys don't, called W, which is an extra wide GR plus I filter, and observing with 4 times in one night one part of the sky so that you can really be sure to catch the moving objects. But in fact, the 3 pi survey was also observed with 2 observations in 30 minutes and another 2 observations later in the night for quads often. So there's a lot of asteroids that came out of the 3 pi survey as well as this solar system dedicated survey. And there's also 2 small targeted surveys that are interesting, but I'm not going to go into them, M31 and this stellar transit field. This is just the distribution of medium deep fields. And you can see that these are clearly targeting high galactic latitude areas. These are interesting areas that other people have done deep surveys. And the primary science drivers are things like supernova cosmology and getting a very deep fields that can be used for doing galaxy cosmology and galaxy clustering kind of studies. The survey, as I said, started in 2010. It ran for 4 years, and since the end of March, basically the beginning of April, we have shifted science observations to this NASA mission. And so now we have a complete data set, and now we are reprocessing it for a last time for delivery to the Mikulski Archive for Space Telescopes, the MAST archive, which we will, at which point we will turn over the curation of that part of the survey to Space Telescope, and they will provide access to the public, just anybody generally, to access the data. Now, we have actually gone through a couple of reprocessings already, and we're now on our 3rd reprocessing of all the data. We probably don't have it right yet. Maybe there will be cache for a 4th reprocessing, but the 3rd reprocessing is the one we're not embarrassed to release to the public. Just some interesting statistics on just the scale of the survey from the 2nd reprocessing. This covered data through December, so it's basically all but a few months of the entire survey data products. So we've got different stages of the processing. Individual exposures, we call the chip level processing, and then there's the combination of the multiple exposures in the sky to generate a deep stack, and then we detect observations in that. So to date, we've got about 60 billion detections in individual exposures and 13 billion detections of objects in individual stacks, in deep stacks. And when you group them together, you find about 7.9 billion unique astronomical objects or something in those individual exposures, and about 2.8 billion in the deep stacks. Why are there more chip objects than stack objects, you might ask? And you would be right to ask that. And the reason is that this should be smaller than that, because these are less sensitive by √12 or so than that. So you can interpret that there's a large number of false detections in here. And if you actually ask for only 2 or more detections, you cut this down by a large amount. So there's something like 2.2 billion objects, real objects, among these 7.9 billion objects. So that tells you something about the challenge of processing this data. There are reasons why we have so many false positives. These are not the most cosmetically beautiful chips you've ever seen, and hopefully won't ever have to see again. But you can get very good results from a data set that's imperfect. The Mikulski Science Archive for Space Telescopes is going to have a relational database of all of this information, all of the huge variety of information that we're pulling out of the observations. But it will also have locally all of the stack images, so all the deep stacks, and also each of the individual epochs pixels, so that it warped into the same projection as the stacks, so that people can do queries and get postage stamps for any spot in that 3 pi area and get the complete light curve history as a set of images. That's about 2 petabytes of imaging data. And so it's a pretty large resource, and I think it's probably one of the largest astronomical data sets to date, soon to be dwarfed by efforts coming down the pipe at LSST.
Will it also have unwarped images?
Not available from them. We will keep them at IFA, but the warps there's not enough space for both sets.
Why not store the non-warped ones and warp it if requested?
It was just the way we agreed. They didn't have the computing resources to do the effort of warping on the fly. So if the community decides that they want the raw data, it's possible for the community to come together and say, we would like to pay for storage at Space Telescope for the raw data to be stored as well, or to gather it from us or so forth. So there are options there.
Will it be possible to send a crate of disks to IFA and get all the raw data copied?
More than just disks might be needed, maybe some labor cost offsets,
Yeah,
but possible, yeah. Negotiations may be needed. So some of the science, let me just go over some of the different interesting science results, and this is by no means exhaustive, but I want to just touch on some of the areas that have been producing a lot of results. So one of the main drivers was, of course, to do the solar system observations, and this was one of the way Pan-STARRS was sold was as a discovery machine for the hazardous objects. And in fact, we have been quite successful at discovering hazardous objects and other near-Earth objects that may be not quite as hazardous. We've also been doing quite well discovering comets. And in fact, this number is a little bit out of date because last month there was a string of nights where we discovered 10 comets in 10 nights, one after the other. That's
Were those in the sweet spot direction you were expecting?
The sweet spot contributes some of the NEOs, but not as nearly as many as we had originally thought. They tended to not be as efficient as we expected. So this is yielding a lot of solar system science about things like disruption rates and the degradation of the solar system. The other big driver that was advertised, another big driver was the Supernova cosmology using the medium deep fields, and there's been a huge number of results coming from Pan-STARRS just from the variety of kinds of supernova events. It's particularly interesting are the ultraluminous supernovae that are coming out, and they're working on getting the final cosmological measurements from the Type 1a supernovae, and this has been sort of one of the earliest productive parts of the project, and certainly will be a major part of the legacy. And at some point, we'll have a very good number for our constraints on W, but I'm not exactly sure how long it will be before that paper is finished. Another area of interest is the high Z quasars. So initially, it was very hard to pull out things like high Z quasars, as people probably remember from the early days of Sloan. But once we started to get the complete stacks in all of the 5 filters, then it was much easier for people to make deep selections by looking for objects which are strong in Y band, weaker in Z, or non-detected in Z band, and non-detected elsewhere. And this has so far yielded a number of greater than 5.5 redshift quasars, and as published already, one 6.5 Z of 6.5 quasars, and I think there are several more in the can that are coming out soon. So here's one of the early ones of those.
Is that like primarily just depth, or is it area, or what's the?
Do you mean the ability to find them with
or just why you're finding more?
There's two things going on. One is certainly depth and area, but the other thing is that we have the red coverage is extra good. So the Y-band red sensitivity is about, well, there's no real direct equivalent. The Z-band is about a magnitude deeper than Sloan, and Y-band is probably about the comparable depth as the Z-band. So for quasar detection. And it also helps that we have this Z minus Y, because that allows us to go and to be sensitive to the notch, so that an object which falls in Y-band is much larger redshift than an object which is only a Z-band drop in Sloan. And one of the interesting things about the evolution of quasars that we're seeing here is that of the things that we're finding at high greater than 5 point, in the sort of vicinity of Z of 6, a larger fraction of those are weak-lying QSOs than at redshifts that are nearby, and you can see something like 25% of them are weak-lying. Oh, it's not on there. Something like 25% of the Z of 6 are weak-lying quasars, whereas it's a much lower fraction at nearby redshifts. So another area is precision photometry. Pan-STARRS, with the repeated observations of the 3 pi region, has the ability to really tie down the photometry of that whole area very well, and to also select out just the photometric data to make an initial cut for doing the photometric analysis. And to date, the reliability already is at the 1% and below the 10 millimagnitude level for the different filters, and I think we'll be able to push that a bit further, a little bit harder in the final calibration. We're still a little bit tweaking up some of the PSF modeling features there. And one of the things that we've done with that is to improve the calibration of the Sloan survey. So Doug Finkbeiner at Harvard started with the calibrated data and then threw the Sloan data at it, and you can see this is the R-band difference and the I-band difference, and you can see there's a certain feature on the sky which looks kind of familiar. So the stripes in the Sloan data set are jumping out at us, and that means that there's a calibration, there's a systematic structure in the Sloan data that is not present in the Pan-STARRS data. And so he goes and basically refits the flat function for, I think he regenerates a new flat, and he regenerates 0 points for stripes, and he gets new residual maps that improve quite significantly. You can see the sigma goes from about 10.7 down to about 8.3. So that's the sigma across the sky for Pan-STARRS minus SDSS. So that means that both of us are doing better than that intrinsically. And you can start to see structures that are the Pan-STARRS observing pattern here. So now we're sort of at the same level of precision in the two surveys.
So for bright stars, or?
This is the bright star. Yeah, yeah. This is sort of the systematic floor.
And what does bright mean there? Like 18?
Probably this is actually probably a statement about 0 points, but the number would be appropriate to stars that are kind of at the 17 magnitude level. So saturation is about 14.5. With a great big set of photometry that's very precise, you can do some interesting things. And Eddie Schlafly, working with Doug Finkbeiner and Greg Green at Harvard, did a very nice analysis taking the photometry of stars in patches and then requiring that those stars be consistent with an increasingly larger amount of extinction, so that there would be dust, planes of dust going out towards the stars, so that as you go to stars that are more distant, you have more dust. And so by looking at the colors of the stars and asking what their spectral energy distribution with some dust would be, and doing some sort of complicated Bayesian assessment of all the possible populations of stars, they've generated basically a 3D model of the dust in small patches going out through the galaxy. And they have a map. Here is a map of the integrated extinction through the galaxy. And if you compare that to Schlegel, Finkbeiner, and Davis, you get basically the realization that they're the same. So we're doing a good job of mapping it. It's actually at a finer spatial scale, our data, and more importantly, it has a 3-dimensional information. So you can actually make a movie of the variation of dust at different depths. And so it's a, a really beautiful result, and it's a very useful result for the science that those guys are actually particularly interested in, which is looking at galactic streams and looking for archaeology in the galaxy. So now, that's other people. Let me move on to stuff that I've actually been involved in as a scientist, not just a data slave. And that's basically the ultra-cool dwarf population in the local solar neighborhood. So the kind of science that I'm interested in here is motivating models of ultra-cool dwarf evolution. And because ultra-cool dwarfs are basically span between stars and planetary mass objects, this also helps us understand planetary evolution and the stellar atmospheres and the atmospheres of planetary atmospheres as well. It puts constraints on star formation because we're really sampling the low mass end of the initial mass function, and the ultra-cool dwarfs in the local solar neighborhood are one of the few ways we can get access to that. There's also some clusters that are close enough that allow you to access that end. So and also there's interesting questions about what are the impacts of the age of objects versus metallicity, and can we distinguish those? Can we distinguish the impact of actual weather on these objects? So what you really want to do these studies is a large, unbiased sample of many, many ultra-cool dwarfs that you've selected across a wide range of object masses and potentially object ages as well. And you need to characterize selection effects, and you need to and it is often helpful to find some peculiar kinds of objects which can let you gain a little bit of extra insight because of their peculiarities. And I'll talk a bit about that in a moment. So down below, I just show this classic picture from that JPL that is the sequence of the ultra-cool dwarfs. And I want to just give a little bit of a discussion of ultra-cool dwarfs in case people are not really familiar with them. When I say ultra-cool dwarf, it's sort of a grab bag for the things which we observe that have the colors and luminosities between the late M objects, which may be stars, but may be brown dwarfs, down to what we now have a spectral type of Y, which may be planetary mass objects. And so we talk about brown dwarfs, stars, brown dwarfs, and planets. We've kind of converged nowadays in the community on the distinction being a distinction of mass, or more specifically, that stars are objects that can burn hydrogen. Brown dwarfs are objects that cannot burn hydrogen, so they're less than the hydrogen burning limit. And planets are objects that can never have had a deuterium burning stage, that they're less than the deuterium burning limit. And you see that this is not a formation distinction, which it could have been, but is instead just a mass distinction. Neither formation nor mass are directly observable, but it's easier to get to mass than it is to get to how the thing actually formed. We have three spectral types that weren't there 15, maybe it's 20 years ago now. The L, or the warmest of the ultra-cool dwarfs, and almost all L dwarfs, I think essentially all L dwarfs are brown dwarfs. There's T dwarfs then that are even cooler, and the difference between these is in whether methane is contributing substantially to the atmospheric structures. And then we've got, but the very coolest one recently discovered are actual Y dwarfs, the newest spectral class, where you start to have ammonia and water playing a substantial role in the atmosphere, in the spectral characteristics of the atmosphere. One of the most important aspects of brown dwarfs that distinguishes them from stars when you try to study them is that they cool forever. When you see an object that is a brown dwarf and you measure its luminosity and temperature, you don't know anything about its mass, because the luminosity and temperature depend both on the mass and the age. So if you know that the luminosity is some value, you could be looking at a young, very low mass object, or you could be looking at an intermediate mass object, or you can be looking at a very, very old, high mass object. And so you need to know something more to be able to really, you can't just place things on an HR diagram and say, aha, that's an X solar mass object, like you can with a mean sequence star. But that also goes the other way. You can potentially use a large collection of brown dwarfs if you can constrain their masses or their ages, or rather, if you can constrain their masses, then you have a sampling of ages that may be a useful way of doing chronology experiments in the local solar neighborhood as well. So brown dwarf evolution has another interesting effect. As I said, as ultra-cool dwarfs, brown dwarfs evolve, time means that they get cooler and cooler. So as they age, they get cooler. And that means they also get fainter. But be careful, because cooler does not always mean redder. So here's an a color magnitude. No, sorry. Here's an HR diagram on the left, and you can see luminosity and effective temperature, and these are M dwarfs, L dwarfs, T dwarfs, and essentially an object will start here and move down through time, down through the sequence, and eventually disappear from sight. In a color magnitude diagram, this behaves somewhat differently. These are the M's, these are the L's, these are the T's, and you can see as things move down into the L's, they get to a point where they suddenly do this shift in their colors, at least in the infrared colors that we usually study these guys in, or at least do a lot of the work in. And as you get to the reddest L dwarfs, they suddenly start to turn very blue and actually bump up in their J-band magnitudes. And then they start to drop in luminosity in J-band magnitudes, essentially. Now, of course, luminosity continues to decrease, but depending on the spectral bands you're looking at, you get a very different behavior. And that is because as you go down this track, the atmosphere's characteristics are changing. Up here, you've got more and more dust in the atmosphere. Silicate dusts are forming dust clouds in the atmosphere, and that makes the objects redder and redder. But at a certain point, the temperature is cool enough that the dust grains start to condense, and the dust gets too heavy, and it starts to rain out, and you get a rain of dust, and the atmosphere is clear out. And you end up with sufficiently transparent atmospheres that completely change the spectral balance, and you end up with much bluer colors in the near infrared. And this transition may happen very quickly, this what we call the LT transition. And so it's one of the things that we want to understand is how do the atmospheres clear? How does the mass of the object at a particular, when it reaches this transition, how does that affect that transition, and how does that affect the observed properties of the object? There's also a similar transition down here, which you can't see, but we are starting to get hints at as things go from the T to the Y age spectral type, because we start to, in the Y band, we start to get water vapor clouds becoming important, and the fraction of the surface covered with water vapor clouds actually has an impact on what we observe. And so we're starting to get to a point where we are more sensitive to weather on the surface of the object than anything else. We can't just treat everybody as a uniform bowling ball anymore.
So I actually thought the transition from L to T was because of the presence of methane in the K-band.
The L to T spectral types are distinguished that way, but the redness, the switch between very red colors to the blue colors, is because of the dust dropping out. Or at least they talk about the dusty models that are required to generate those the spectral types over there, the broadband spectral energy distributions over there. So the strong features that you see are the presence of methane coming in.
Because it is really strong in the K-band?
Yeah.
So it's not that it's not that,
yeah,
Star Trek, we were in J.
Yeah. It's but in fact, the overall spectral energy distribution is shifting because of the presence of no longer the presence of the dust. So we have a pretty concerted effort to find and work with these ultra-cool dwarfs in using PS1. And PS1 is well suited to find ultra-cool dwarfs because it does have this good red sensitivity, but also because it has high precision astrometry with multiple epochs, and I'll talk a bit more about how we've done some of that work. We've been able to calibrate the astrometry quite well, and but we also scheduled the observations in a way that makes it optimal for pulling out parallaxes. So basically, the Z and the Y band filters, which are also the red sensitive filters, no coincidence, are scheduled to be observed at the beginning of the night or at the end of the night, but looking in opposition. So we get the largest parallax factor in those two bands. And so we get a strong parallax signal from the Z and the Y filters, and therefore we get a strong parallax from the things that are nearby, which should have a parallax. So we have a group at the IFA, myself, Mike Liu, and students Kimberly Aller and William Best, and we've had a couple of postdocs come through, and Neil Deacon, who was at the IFA and is now moved on, and there's also other groups within Pan-STARRS who are working on ultra-cool dwarfs with us. Bertrand Goldman, Wolfgang Brandner, Wenping Chen, Roger Lin, Poshi Chang. So there's a sort of dispersed group, and there tends to be a bit of focus in the different institutions on different areas. Most of the work that I'll be talking about was done by our group at the IFA, but Neil has continued to work with us quite heavily. So we started off by simply comparing pan-stars in the early epochs to 2-mass and trying to find brown dwarfs based on proper motions between the pan-stars epoch and the 2-mass epoch. And this is quite fruitful. We found a lot of T-dwarfs, which we're still working to get into a publishable form. But it limited us to a certain, we had to really restrict the color range in order to not be completely contaminated by false detections. One of the things that was scientifically interesting that came out of that were some interesting particular oddities. So there are a couple of particular extrema. One was a very high proper motion object, which was a very late T8 was I think our latest spectral type object, and now that niche has been swamped by Ys, which has come in and discovered all the late T and early Y objects. But another area where we found some interesting is this object which we call PSO 318-22. This is basically one of the most extreme L dwarfs out there. So it is a very, very red. You can see it's as red as possible on this plot. And the other objects that are nearby are actually planetary mass objects that are associated with other primary stars. So this is a planetary mass. These are all essentially planets around their primary. And this guy is not associated with another object, except it is associated by its motion on the sky with the beta-Pic moving group. And so we know its age. And if you know the age, because of the relationship, you now have a better handle on the mass. So unlike other free-floating planets which have been reported, for which the mass range includes the planetary mass, this object has an upper limit on the mass, because we know the age, which is less than the planetary mass limit. So this is an interesting extrema case. If you're interested in collecting postage stamps, in some sense that's what that is. But in reality, this kind of object lets us explore the boundaries of the stellar evolution questions. It's important to know, to be able to constrain the ages of these objects in order to get at their mass, or vice versa. And so one way to do this is to find objects that are associated with moving other known objects. And so some of the serendipitous early discoveries that we had were brown dwarfs that were in common proper motion with a Hipparcos star. So for example, here is a star which is a Hipparcos star nearby with a certain proper motion, and it turned out that our discovery here, I think it was that one, maybe it was that one, actually it's hard to even tell, had the same proper motion. You wouldn't know that they were associated except for the fact that they have a common proper motion and their photometric distances are consistent. So we believe that objects like that are associated. And then if you find the right primaries, main sequence stars, some main sequence stars are easier to date than others, and then you can start to constrain, because you think they're both formed at the same time, you can constrain the properties of that brown dwarf. And this lets us test things like, do the evolutionary model, the temperatures that come off from following the stellar evolution to that luminosity, temperature, and mass, are those consistent with what we think the spectral emission features tell us about the temperature of that object? And this has historically been kind of problematic, but the models are starting to be in better agreement so that we actually start to get consistent atmosphere and evolutionary model predictions. So this led to a little bit of an industry. Neil Deacon went off and looked for all possible Hipparcos common motion companions and basically choose a Hipparcos star that's within some distance limit and has a well-measured proper motion, and ask what within the nearby vicinity are there any objects that have the same proper motion that photometrically then could be at the same distance. And he came up with 48 new common proper motion systems and 23 recovered systems, and you can use those then potentially as more of these so-called benchmarks, where if enough of these 48 primaries can be well dated, then you can use those as more systems to constrain stellar evolution models and atmospheric models. Now, you can ask, what are the separations and the mass of the system, and are these systems likely to stay together, and are they actually gravitationally bound? And it turns out that most of them are actually pretty loosely bound. Anything below this dotted line, this dashed line, is depending on your model of how things are formed and bound together, it could be the dotted line or the dashed line, are thought to be not gravitationally bound. But anybody above this line, so let me rephrase that. This line tells you how far apart you'd have to be for the galactic disk to pull you apart and dissociate you in 2 gigayears, 5 gigayears, or 10 gigayears. So it would take a long time for these almost not bound objects to really get dispersed by the galaxy. Finding things where you can date the object is useful, and so another way of doing that is to take the young moving groups in the vicinity of the sun and try to find more objects that are part of those young moving groups. A young moving group is essentially an open cluster in the vicinity of the sun. It's a loose enough open cluster that you don't see them all sitting together in one spot in the sky, but you know that they're a cluster because they have the same proper motion, the same space velocity on the sky, and if you track back that space velocity, they come to a common point. And there are a handful of these reasonably well-studied young moving groups nearby. And so one of our students at IFA, Kimberly Aller, has done a great job of going through the Pan-STARRS proper motion database and trying to find objects which are consistent with any of those known moving groups. And basically you ask 2 questions. Is the angle between the proper motion vectors consistent? Is they're basically moving in the same direction? And also, if I take the space velocity of that moving group and then take the observed proper motion vector, because I don't have all 3 dimensions, if I ask what distance do I have to be at in order for those 2 to be in alignment, how does that distance compare with the distance distribution of that cluster? And if you get objects that agree well between those 2 parameters, then you can say, well, maybe this is a common proper motion object. Let's go get spectroscopy. Let's see if the age is consistent. There are features in the spectra which give hints at the age. This is the spectrum of a young object. This is the spectrum of an old object. And you can see that the H-band peak here gets pointier as you get younger. And so if you see that the object has roughly the same motion as the moving group of interest, and it's young as well, then you can start to have more confidence. There's more statistical tests that can be applied. The Magnier-Banyan website is particularly useful for this because they can take some of the parameters and give you probability for association. And so she's come up with a few new AB door members and a couple of possibles that maybe are suspicious in her first pass, and it looks like she's getting a bunch more from some of the other moving groups. So the moving group association is very helpful because the moving group is an open cluster, and therefore you know from the older stars what the age is, or at least you have a pretty good constraint to the age of the moving group, and therefore age constraint means mass constraint and so forth. So more population work. I talked about this LT transition. One of the questions is how quickly does that transition happen? Because there is a time scale for the dust clouds to settle out and for the objects to move from one side of this structure from the L band, the L objects here to the T object regime over here. And it's been noted in the past that this region is somewhat depleted, but that could be observational bias as well. And so it's good to get a good large sample of LT objects that are in this L to T transition. And it turns out that Pan-STARRS plus WISE photometry is very efficient for finding objects in that regime. And here's just an early sample of the objects that our student Will Best at IFA has pulled out. These are objects where the Pan-STARRS minus WISE color versus a WISE color highlights objects in that particular spectral type range. And he's now got, I didn't put the number on here, but I think it's something like 45 objects in this regime. So we're starting to get a good population of objects in this LT transition to really get an idea. But the trick is, this is just selecting out objects of arbitrary distances. What we really want to know is distances. And so we want to use the parallax capabilities of Pan-STARRS to get a good solid handle on that. And I'm clearly not going to be able to go into all the systematic effects that I have to talk about. So Pan-STARRS parallaxes are finally starting to be very useful, and so we can do 2 things. One is we can potentially do a blind parallax-based search for objects in the local solar neighborhood. And we can also use the parallaxes for any of the objects that we already know are in the local solar neighborhood. And this is the latter, taking objects where previously known dwarfs, some of with real astrometrically measured parallaxes from careful observations as the red dots, and then some for which we have a photometric-based guess at the distance. And then on this axis is the external measurement or guess at the parallax from the photometry. And on this axis is our pan-stars-based parallax just on the pan-stars data. And you can see we got a nice trend here with some interesting outliers, but we have pretty good consistency between this line is not a fit, but it's just the line of unity. So we are measuring parallaxes for nearby dwarfs, and we are pushing on the data to try to get as good a measurement as low numbers on the error bars as we can, because we think we can push a little bit harder. And of course, the baseline of 4 years gets us the most power in the parallax measurement. And so it looks at this point like we're able to go down to, this is about 4 milliarc seconds for the parallax error bar. And that translates to, lets us go out to distances of 30 to 40 parsecs for the objects that are well measured, greater than signal noise of 7. And so we start to have these, so these blue dots are all the objects for which we have signal noise in the parallax greater than 7. And so we're going to start to try to really make sure that we believe the parallaxes and that outlier rejection is being done right and characterize each of their parallax measurements. And now we'll have a good sample of parallaxes of objects in the local solar neighborhood. And so just as in comparison, this black histogram is all of the things in what is called the Dwarf archives, a collection of the L and T objects and some of the latest M's in the local solar neighborhood that's kept by Adam Bergasser. And the blue line is the set of those objects for which good, well-measured parallaxes done by individual observation sets were performed. And we'll be adding this red histogram on top of that. So we'll be contributing a lot of parallaxes, especially in this early L regime here. But we're not doing so well in the L to T transition regime, where it would be nice to get some good population statistics. So Will Best is now going on and targeting objects that he selected based on the pan-stars Ys and colors, and starting with the pan-stars parallax, we'll supplement with Euclid observations so that we can get really good volume complete sample from basically the bottom of the top of the brown dwarfs, the bottom of the stellar locus, out to just about the latest T's. T7, I think, is where he's really complete. And he starts to lose it around T8 for all the objects within 25 parsecs. And so we should have a very nice volume-limited sample by the time this work is done in a couple of years, starting from the pan-stars parallaxes. And we soon will have our first parallax discovery paper out, where we blindly search for objects using just the parallaxes and a very limited color cut, and we were able to find objects that we confirm are nearby late, in general, relatively early L's, but low-mass brown dwarfs. Now, I don't know how late I'm supposed to go. Should I?
10, 15 minutes.
Okay, so I have a little bit of time to talk about systematic effects. So clearly, yeah, there's a tiny little clock right here. Clearly, we need to have good control of our astrometric measurements. We need to have both high precision and also very good control over our systematic errors. And the better we can do there, the better we can do with pulling out objects based on, especially on parallax. One of the real tricky parts about using parallax as a way of discovering objects is that if you go just a little bit too red, you're suddenly very, very quickly swamped by 100 million objects, none of which are nearby, but any occasional 5 sigma deviation can give you a handful of interesting objects, what look like interesting objects. So Gaussian errors can be a problem if you accept even a little bit too much of the background objects. So some of the systematic effects then really screw you up if you have them. So some of the systematic effects that we have had to worry about and are still worrying about are differential chromatic refraction. That should be generally familiar to people at some level. the Copenhagen effect, which shouldn't be familiar to anybody unless they've been involved in this work, which is unique. Tree rings, which I'll come to, and optics in the atmosphere, both of which are critically important. So let me start with the Copenhagen effect, because you shouldn't probably have heard of that. So one of the Pan-STARRS scientists, Johannes Copenhagen, realized that he was having problems with astrometry, and eventually we tracked it down to a weird effect in the camera such that objects on half of the detectors would be biased in one direction, in the x direction, as if the brighter they were. The faint stars, no problem, but at a certain point they started to get biased the brighter they got. And you can see that plotted somewhat here. So this is basically a plot of the deviation for a detection relative to the mean of that object in very small little instrumental surface brightness bands. It's instrumental magnitude plus 5 times the log of the 4th half max, so basically it's a measurement of the central surface brightness at some level. And as you go from the faint end, where things are nice and consistent, to a certain point, things sort of ramp down. Basically, stars move more quickly towards the X readout than they should. And this is just some weird voltage effect, apparently. It's not CTE, that things are not being dragged back, they're being pushed forward. And by tweaking the voltages on the camera, once this was known, the camera team were able to remove this effect. Great, but it meant that half of the data was contaminated. So we have to measure, which we can, and correct it. And it turns out that you can correct it pretty well. And if you apply that correction, even the good chips get much better. And so this is the residual astrometry for a good chip, which doesn't suffer that effect, before we've made that correction to the other chips. And you get a 25 millisecond floor and a turn up at the bright end because you're being buggered up by the other measurements from the other detectors. When we take out that correction, we get a nice 18 millisecond floor and no longer a bright edge trend. And so it's clearly you want to do that kind of thing. We also want to take out differential chromatic refraction. This contributes a non-trivial amount of scatter. So this is basically the deviation, in a similar fashion, this is the deviation from the mean for individual detections as a function of the difference between the mean color for that image, the mean color of the objects that we use to calibrate that image, versus the color of that minus the color of that specific object times an air mass term. Actually, that should be tangent of the zenith distance, but I put in air mass minus 1. And so you can see that it clearly has a nice strong variation that contributes about 80 milliarc seconds in the parallactic angle direction, and there is no contribution in the cross-parallactic angle direction, as you would expect. So we can just measure that trend and subtract it off, and that helps to bring down our typical scatter from that 18 milliarc second down to about 15 milliarc second, or even 12 in some cases. There are a few large-scale effects. If you just do that same sort of trick of asking for the residuals versus the mean for objects as a function of position on the camera, you get this interesting multicolored map. So this is a set of all the chips, the 8x8 grid of chips, and in each chip there's an 8x8 grid of little cells. And the green areas are areas where there's no good pixels. Yeah, it's not a great camera. And the red to blue is deviations in the x direction on the focal plane in the astrometric residuals. And you can see there's clearly large-scale systematic structures. This maps to ripples in the focal surface, which effectively translate to small changes in the PSF shape. And this tells us that we probably should take a much finer sampling of our PSF model, but we don't have enough stars to do that, so we'll have to correct this at the detection level. And I can talk a couple minutes about the tree rings. So there's an effect called the tree rings, which has been discussed particularly a lot by the dark energy survey folks, but also by a couple of other teams now, where you see an astrometric residual that follows a pattern. This is one chip that follows a pattern that is sort of ring-shaped. So this chip is actually one quadrant of a silicon bool. The other three chips were up here, up here, up here, here. And the center of the bool was here. So the bool was grown. And as it grows, I now understand from where did he go? What's that? He's on a plane already?
He's on the phone.
Oh, okay. Steve was saying that it's actually the diurnal changes in the pressure of the environment where the boule is being grown that changes the dopants, and you essentially get what is happening observationally is that if you have effectively changes in the pixel scale, and it's not really changes in the actual size of a pixel laid out on the device, it's actually changes in the electric field that move the electrons as they drop into the well in ways that change the effective area observed by each pixel. And this is essentially a radial term out from that center of the boule. And so you can see these interesting little rings. It's actually more complicated than that. It turns out that in our camera, unlike dark energy survey, and I'll just skip over this, in our camera, unlike that, this is the flat field term. That maps to a flat field term because you're changing the effective pixel scale. So when you look at a uniform surface brightness flat field source, different size effective areas mean more or less flux. And if you flatten with that, you're actually making an error. You're introducing a photometric error that you shouldn't be making. And it turns out that that is also seen by the dark energy survey camera. But we also see another effect, which is that, sorry, this is just to say that those two agree as you would expect for changing pixel scale. But if you look at PSF photometry, it turns out that you should expect to see the photometry follow those flat field errors. I was making a flat field error by applying that flat field. But in fact, we see a very different pattern. And it turns out that this pattern in the PSF photometry is coming because, you don't see it in the aperture photometry, it's coming because, let me just skip to this one, the 4.5 max of the stars is changing. The PSF itself is changing in these tree rings as well. And it's changing in a way that is circularly symmetric. If you look at the sum of the second moments, or the sigma squared major, sigma squared minor, you're looking at the circular term of the PSF. That's changing substantially following the tree rings. The difference, which tells us about ellipticity, doesn't follow those tree ring patterns at all. They follow something that's probably coming from the optics. So this is basically a map of the elongation changes of the PSF. We would have expected radial changes in the astrometry to change the shape of the PSF in a radial fashion, but we don't see that. And it's because there's two effects going on here. One is that we're getting changes in the diffusion, so that if a photon lands here, it looks like it diffuses because of perhaps travel time in the device a lot more than if it lands here. And so those changes in the diffusion show up as changes in 4.5 max, show up as changes in PSF photometry, and so forth. And related to that, but at a much lower level, are also changes in the plate scale that affect the astrometry. So, cartoon of that. So let me just jump to the conclusion. So PS1 has finally become a productive system, and there's lots and lots of science coming out, but there's a lot of science that can still be done with the data set, which is going to be public. So if you have an interest in large-scale survey data archive analysis, there is a large archive coming your way soon. Please access it and do the science that we failed to do. The astrometric survey component is quite helpful for ultra-cool dwarf searches, but I think we can still do a bit more improvement to the astrometric calibration work there. And in general, just beware of the unknown and unexpected, and plot everything versus everything. And that's it.
Let me open up for questions for G.
So is everything going to be in the release, or just a 3 pi survey? Is the medium deep going to be in there as well?
Everything is going to be in the release. 3 pi, medium deep, the solar system observations, the stellar transit M31 fields. Those are all supposed to be.
Okay, what about the ones that you said there were a lot of like single detections? So are those going to be in there, or because some of those single detections could be transient, right? So
that's a very good point. The complete detections that we get in the third analysis will go in there, and we cleaned up some of the instrumental artifacts going into the third analysis, so that number should drop some, but it won't drop by a factor of 2. And so we're just going to put them all in there for exactly that reason. it will be hard for people to find things on that basis, but if they have some knowledge that this is an interesting location, they'll be able to go back and look at that. And since the warps are there, if there's something that we didn't detect, you will be able to go to the warps and just have that time history as well of that location. Bruce?
The second generation detectors likely have the same kinds of defects as the first?
Oh, you mean the Pan-STARRS 2 telescope? The Pan-STARRS 2 telescope's detectors so far look much better. So some of the worst features are definitely gone. There is a correlated read noise problem, there's a persistence problem, and some glows that were really bad that are definitely improved. There are some corner glows that are still there, and I think that they're hoping to get... So we have 45 devices in the camera now. 20 are really science grade, and so I think they're hoping that the next batches that come through will make a complete science grade set. And they're actually hoping to upgrade the PS1 focal plane so that when the NASA mission is done in 2017, they'll be in a position to have 2 telescopes with good focal planes for the next Pan-STARRS 3 generation survey set. Consortiums to be formed at some point.
So you had a plot with it was bounded by I think 20 RJ and half RJ.
Right.
I was wondering about that. I thought as the brown dwarf got bigger, the radius didn't change much.
Yeah, that's mostly errors and also age. So where is it? Yeah, there we go. Some of that's just statistical, but some of that is that my radius is a simplified version of a radius because it's just 4 pi r squared, 4 pi r cubed squared to the 4 sigma. And this is bolometric, not full luminosity. Oh no, that's bolometric luminosity. Well, I guess it must be statistical. But there is also an effect that the younger the objects are, for a given temperature, they are a little bit inflated.
Did you have an automated pipeline for your astrometry reductions, or did you have to select each object?
Oh no. There's a database of 60 billion detections, and everybody gets astrometrized. The way it works is we calibrate the images iteratively, so that there's good quality calibration for all of the image transformations, and then each object, after we think the astrometry is calibrated well, then we believe the measurements, and then we just fit parallaxes and proper motions to every object. And one of the areas that we're weak in is doing a good job in that process of outlier rejection, because you really want to know what the path of the object is before you throw something away, and there's a sort of iterative process that can be done there that we don't get to.
So you didn't talk at all about the variability aspect of that. You've got several epochs for every object, and that can really get at the intrinsic width of this turnover and this exchange from LT.
Yeah, that's true. And one of the questions, I guess, when you model that transition is, given the sample that you've got, have you any constraints on it from variability? There's also the question of just the metallicity distribution, because metallicity has a cutoff contributor as well, and that's connected with the age as well.
So you mentioned you did cross matching with Ys and 2mass. Have you done the same thing with the SDSS, and does that help in these kind of searches?
We have not actually focused on doing the SDSS cross, mostly for reasons of inertia. And it would be very useful to do that, but just lack of time. The motivation there is basically that, 2mass and Ys are 3 pi, or 3 pi. It's suddenly restricting ourselves.
So another 3 pi survey is going to be Gaia in a year or so, and I'm guessing that will be very useful.
And there's a tricky thing about that overlap. Gaia goes down to G of 19.5 or 20, depending on what they currently think that is. And but G of 19.5 is not so deep for an object that's basically very, very, very red. So we'll have an interesting synergy between where Gaia can go and where we can go. I think Gaia will be able to go as late as M7 or 8, maybe in 9, and contribute a lot, but I think that we will still have most of the things in the later.
Maybe one more question.
The dust maps are really cool. I'm just wondering, is there a lot of overlap with the LSST sky?
It's not terrible, but that great big blue hole. I mean, this is minus 30.
Okay.
And so the LSST sky goes up to what, minus 0? So yeah, so you get a good chunk. 1/3 of our data is in the LSST sky. Yeah. And
a little circle over there on the left.
that has been called the Magnier hole by some of my detractors. This is basically a chunk of data at the North Pole that we, for one reason or another, didn't get processed in time for them to do this work, and they were waiting for it, blah, 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 blah. We've filled the Magnier hole now.
All right, so I'll just finish with one comment, which is I remember when I was starting astronomy, how everybody was happy with these newfangled devices called CCDs because, in contrast to plates, they were wonderful. They were linear. They had no weird effects. You didn't have to worry about anything. And so, thank you for ruining it for us.
How our times have changed.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm curious to see what bias response